I wore prescription glasses at the age of 4, and my vision has become more myopic with every passing year. At the age of 5, I ran my first 5K. My father took my glasses off my face and told me to follow the white lines. I vividly remember the feeling of panic and disorientation when he removed my vision and expected me to run 3.2 miles as fast as I could. So I ran, and I finished, and it was literally a blur. That day marked the beginning of a pattern that would lead me through adversity and into wisdom. This is Soul Mechanics, practical tune-ups to be a healthy human, and I'm your host, Kate Foley. When I was 15, I was a sophomore in high school. I was an honor roll student. I was a track and cross-country runner. I was a star swimmer. I came from a family of runners. Sundays were often spent at a small local event, marathons, or triathlons. One day after school and before track practice, I walked to my locker and I realized I forgot my running shoes. The person I was dating at the time offered to drive me home to get my shoes. We arrived in the driveway, I ran inside, and grabbed my purple and pink Nike Air Pegasus running shoes. I won't ever forget those shoes because that's the last thing I remember. After grabbing my Nikes, I woke up in a fog of bright white light and a high-pitched, unrelenting static sound. I stood in a paved intersection, almost in a daze of observation, staring at a girl with half her body hanging outside of a car, blood-splattered glass on the ground, in her hair and all over her arms. I couldn't identify her. Curiously, I turned my orientation to an adjacent street. There were cars lined up and a crowd of people talking excitedly while looking at the smashed car. I spotted someone sitting in his car. I recognized him. He looked in my eyes and I looked back. Just as we met eyes, mine snapped open. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like a vice was gripping it. My head was pounding. The pain was so severe I reached up to touch it and felt nothing but warm, sticky fluid. I looked at my fingers and they were bright red. I felt a heavy weight on my chest. I looked down and I saw the person who was driving. I started pushing him off me. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly a voice came in from my right and said, "Honey, don't move him. Honey, stop." I couldn't stop. He was crushing me. Then the questions started. What is your name? What year is it? Who's the President of the United States? Can you move your legs? I don't know. I don't know. Ronald Reagan? No. Wait, yes. Then the noise came. Then the instructions. Then the crowbars and the firefighters. Then the helicopter. Then the trauma center. Then the scans. The surgeon. The explanation. Then the drive home. Then more scans. Then the psychological tests. Then more explanations. And then frustration beyond what I could comprehend. I was in a car accident when I was 15. The person driving the car, I would discover later, was on drugs. He ran a stop sign and the car was T-boned on the passenger side. The car went into a spin. He wasn't wearing his seatbelt. The weight of his body broke my ribs and fractured my wrist. No one ever admitted to it, but it was possible that his weight thrust my body through the passenger side window. I sustained multiple concussions that day, and through various brain scans and psychological tests, I would come to understand that I lost 30% of my short-term memory and attention span. All in all, the acute injury was rehabilitated and seemingly to an outsider, probably benign. But to me, I lost my ability to respond to any sort of stress appropriately. I lost much of my athletic ability because of my inability to respond. I lost a significant portion of my short-term memory, and to this day, that remains the case. Loud noises, bright lights, expectations, pressure, all were and still are to some extent intolerable. After the accident, my grades plummeted. Everything became challenging. I became extremely emotional and erratic. I contemplated suicide on 3 occasions. and I also cut myself periodically for years, just to feel something other than misunderstood. People who didn't know me thought I was flaky and slow. Several months following the accident, I heard people talk about me and say things like, "What's her problem? Her head isn't bleeding anymore. Her ribs aren't broken. She can move her wrist." And as the years moved on, I grew more emotional. I couldn't understand what was happening. No one explained to me that a severe head injury would cause so much trouble processing information, perceiving stress, and emotionally navigating life and relationships. But most of all, the social isolation and the lack of education were the worst. Many of us have these types of experiences. It doesn't have to happen in childhood. It can happen at any time in our lives. It can be a fire that burns your house down, or an abusive marriage, or you lose your job, or someone or many people you love die. But when everything or many things are stripped away, I think this is an opportunity to wake up those other senses. What are those other senses? Challenges awaken sadness, or anger, or depression, or any other emotion that conjures discomfort. But these emotional states transport us into a foreign part of ourselves. Perhaps someone we've never known. This is a unique journey because many times we've been floating along in perhaps a life of comfort, support, and encouragement. But when everything is turned upside down, life becomes wild and unpredictable. Life can seem cruel and merciless. But what is really happening? I think we're being challenged to find something within that we've never known. Many times, this involves prayer and developing a relationship with your maker, with your source. I say this a lot through my podcast because prayer and a relationship with God is essential for gaining access to my deeper aspects. I'm not a religious person. I'm a person who separates spirituality from religion. I can attest that the day I woke up in that car in a pool of blood, I felt something or someone close by. Definitely benevolent, certainly observant. I don't believe in protection, but I felt surrounded. Did I see angels? No. Could I have died? Maybe. Did I have an out-of-body experience? Yes. There is something intangible. I think it will always be intangible, and as long as the universal laws remain, we will have a mystery. For me, the mystery keeps me alive and moving. I haven't completely and accurately described all the challenges associated with that head injury. It's been over 30 years of misunderstandings, frustration, periodic depression, pain, isolation, and forgetfulness. To this day, when someone sees all the lists I have on my table, or in my calendar, or in my car, or on my fridge, and they say, "Oh, I have the same problem," I bristle. If you know someone with a severe head injury, please be sensitive and don't diminish their experience. You can't see the head injury on the outside, but I can assure you, the injury is always there, and it reminds the injured person in new and creative ways every day. It isn't about memory loss or slow processing. People can deal with that. It's the unbearable weight of everyday life and stress. Things that normal people can handle, people like me can't. And I'm lucky. I walked out of that hospital. There are people who spend weeks, months, and years recovering in an institution from head injuries. It's a unique type of grief, and often something very misunderstood by our culture. I was essentially a child when this accident happened. There was so much that wasn't explained to me. I didn't have any type of physical therapy, and there really wasn't much education on head injuries back then. I sort of had to feel my way in the dark, and I did. I think I've become a tougher person because of this experience. But I've also become extremely sensitive and defensive of people with head injuries. Yes, our brains are incredibly resilient and adaptable, and someone like me was able to recover and continue on with my life. However, I think my abilities to navigate my emotional landscape were permanently altered. Since that accident, I've struggled with identifying and expressing my emotions. My perceptions of stress have altered significantly, and this has interfered with my academic aspirations, jobs, relationships, and my general sense of well-being. When a child's senses are taken away, and they're expected to excel with nothing, and they naturally disappoint those who are expecting them to excel, this can only lead to internal senses being ignited. When everything gets stripped away, when someone is told that they are nothing, and all their resources have vanished, they have to dig deep. They have to reach for the sacred. They have to develop extra senses and new talents. What are extra senses? Perception, reading a room, reading the emotions of a person, the ability to control your internal processes like breath and heart rate to be able to respond appropriately, body and thought control, assessing an environment for safety or for comfort, developing firm boundaries, knowing who actually cares and who doesn't, and finally, tuning into subtle energies. I've downplayed that out-of-body experience at the scene of the car accident, but that experience led me to understand what it's like to shift my consciousness and exist in other planes. It was by far one of the most significant signposts in my life. I read once in a tarot card book that fire is needed for transformation. Many talk therapists call it hot cognition. I believe this is true. Although fire doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of anger, my fire was anger. I utilized anger to transform my head injury from resignation to discovery. At some point, I realized that I needed to use my brain differently, that there must be a different path. I couldn't just sit and dwell on what was lost. I had to wander through the overgrowth to develop my own path. Now, I find my slow processing to be beneficial in the context of helping people. I don't think cognitive speed is necessarily an asset when actively listening. This brain injury taught me to pause. That pause creates space and clears distractions. It also has given me stillness. Sometimes I sit and stare at the wall without thinking, with very little thought, not because I'm intending it or meditating, but because I can't process too much stimulation. So I move into some sort of mental non-space. I also can't multitask. I can only focus on one action at a time. Only now can I see that this brain injury has made me a more intentional person. It's highlighted the practice of compassion with myself and with others. I know from my own experience that when I look at someone and begin to judge them, because we all do, that I really have no idea what's going on for them. I choose to see people through a compassionate lens, because that's what I would want from others. We are all complex and unique, young and old. We have stories that complete us and break us. None of us can look at another and know where we are on the spectrum of our story. I think it's really important to understand that one of life's great paradoxes is the idea of challenge. Allowing yourself to feel the full range of grief and, yes, negativity of a challenge can thrust you forward to transforming it into a strength. We can all utilize our challenges for growth. We all know this. We've all heard the stories of anguish turned into triumph. However, it seems to me that these stories focus on the force of will and the resulting empowered self. What is underplayed or undervalued is the time of struggle. In my opinion, This time of struggle and anguish is just as important as triumph. Finding our way through the dark is where we gain our senses. The darkness is where we discover new aspects of ourselves. It's where we can't see the path that we end up gaining ground. When you're facing a challenge, I recommend embracing the dark. Learn about those new foreign voices. Use your hands instead of your eyes. Create a new path for yourself. Your new senses and strength are already there, waiting to guide you. This is Kate Foley. Thank you for listening.